So here we begin our reading of Plato's Phaedo. The dialogue begins, if you look at the pagination of the PDF, or not the PDF pagination, but the original book pagination. It starts on page 195. You don't need to worry about reading anything else, just the dialogue itself. There's a long, really quite helpful introduction by Benjamin Jowett, the translator, the 19th century great translator of Plato, but you don't need to read that unless you want to. The dialogue itself begins on page, we're on 195 here, right? And that's where you need to begin, or that's where we should begin in this dialogue, which is great work and, a very demanding sort of thing. It's the longest thing we've read so far. It's great, but there are some arguments, some really essential arguments here that it takes some effort to follow and to understand. Well, we can all do that. It is dialogue. It was written by Plato 2,500 years ago. It is meant to reflect the last hours of his friend Socrates, who had been convicted of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens, and the day has come where he's going to be executed. And this dialogue purports to be an account of how Socrates spent his last hours before he died by drinking the hemlock. How, as always with Plato, we can never really be sure to what degree this dialogue has any relation to anything that actually happened, any conversation that actually happened, or how accurately it reflects the historical Socrates. We don't know those things. I mean, scholars can make good guesses, but what we have is a conversation between Socrates and his friends, and it's a very dramatic context. Right? Quite clearly, the dialogue centers on the question of death and the possibility of an immortal soul, possibility of a continued existence after death. And of course, the dramatic context is that Socrates and everyone else know that he's about to die. So it's got this very real flavor to it. He's talking about something. Socrates will often refer to the fact that this is a serious question for him right now, because he knows that his death is imminent. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. We get we may talk about it more. Sort of dramatic introduction to the situation and how everyone was feeling and who was there and why Socrates had been in the prison so long, and then Phaedo actually begins to relate. Phaedo, who is an eyewitness, begins to relate the actual conversation that these men began to have with one another once Socrates awoke. And some really interesting stuff here. Maybe we'll come back to it, about Socrates talking about writing poetry in prison, which was very uncharacteristic of him. He was not a writer, first of all, and he was not a poet. He was a speaker, a dialectician, a philosopher. So the first striking thing, of course, that he says is that if anyone's a philosopher, they will welcome death. And that becomes the real, maybe the question. How can you say such a thing? Why would anybody welcome death? And especially the philosopher. That's the first, I would say that's the first big question you need to answer for yourself. Why would Socrates say that the philosopher especially is not afraid of death, actually welcomes it, looks forward to it? There's a brief argument that says that you should never commit suicide, but you certainly shouldn't consider death a bad thing. And, given going back to the first part of the course, you should actually consider it a good thing. If you're a philosopher, then the question is why? How does he justify that claim? But where do we start here philosophically? It is an examination of death, or more particularly an examination of the question whether the human being, the human person, has any existence after death occurs. I thought that amongst everything, all the interesting things that he says, that there was one remark that would be good to pay fairly close attention to, and that is, I believe, on page 203. Socrates has floated this idea that, as he says here, this is on page 202, I guess. I desire to prove to you that the real philosopher has reason to be of good cheer when he is about to die, and that after death he may hope to obtain the greatest good in the other world. What is that greatest good? And why should the philosopher especially be of good cheer? In a certain sense, that's what the whole dialogue is about, is justifying that idea that death is a good thing. It's not nothing, as Epicurus said it was. It's not a bad thing, perhaps, as Nagel was trying to establish. Not that it was always bad, but for the philosopher, at least, it's a good thing. How could somebody say that? Just to round it out here again and continue. And how this may be, Simmias and Sebes, I will endeavor to explain, for I deem that the true votary of philosophy is likely to be misunderstood by other men. They do not perceive that he is always pursuing death and dying. And if this be so, and he has had the desire of death all his life long, why, when his time comes, should he repine at that which he has been always pursuing and desiring? This notion that philosophy is a practice for death. It's a pursuit of death. What a strange thing to say. So he's really got to explain himself. Because what he said just seemed rather absurd, actually. But so he's got to start arguing somewhere, right? And there is a remark he's made here at the top of page 203 when he begins. This is where he begins a serious sort of dialectic, the examination of the question of the philosopher at death. At the top of page 203, he asks Simmias, "Do we believe that there is such a thing as death?" "To be sure," replied Simmias. "Is it not the separation of soul and body?" And Simmias agrees. Yeah, that's what death is. That's very important. That is the starting point for Plato. We think of Epicurus, and we can think of this text in a certain sense of being the anti-Epicurus, and we can think of Epicurus's letter to Menoicus and this text as being the two most profound examinations or statements about death that come from the ancient world, come from classical philosophy, and they're utterly incompatible. That's something I think you gotta, in the context of what you're reading for the course, that you should note that Epicurus and Plato can't both be right. Epicurus says that death is the absolute end. It's the privation of all consciousness. It's when we are, that means death hasn't come, and when death has come, that means we are not. That is entirely, you could say that the starting point, the absolute sort of baseline assumption that